Thank you, CU. That kind of warms us up. That's good. Tēnā koutou te whānau o Auckland Unitarian. Tēnā koutou nā manahiri. No mai, hire mai, ki tēnei whare karakia a te atua. We welcome you into this circle of community. Welcome into the space made sacred by Auckland Unitarians for 116 years. What made it sacred, you might ask? Fair question. There are the usual things that make any religious space sacred. We have celebrated new life and grieved death together. We have partied together and disagreed with each other. We have dreamed together and made some of those dreams come true. We have shared our stories with each other, learned from each other, cared about each other. We have worshiped with each other week in and week out. That would be enough normally, but we have gone further. Since our first minister, a Christian socialist, we have sought to leave the world a better place than we found it. We have stood up for human rights, the environment, social justice, the outcast, and peace. We have done that individually, inspired by this community, and as a community. Today, our speaker is someone I am less than unbiased about. For our guests and visitors' benefit, Rachael Mcintosh is my partner, of whom I am justly proud. She is deeply committed to the values of Unitarianism, for they match her work as the Vice President of the Council of Trade Unions and her position as the National Director of Organizing for A2, New Zealand's largest private sector union. She has recently spent 2 weeks in Geneva at the annual UN International Labor Organization meeting as New Zealand's labor delegate. The meeting was focused on the human right of not suffering violence and harassment in the workplace. She's going to speak about her experience there, but I need to warn you that her talk does refer to rape and sexual violence, which may be difficult for some. This morning, my opening words are actually going to be our opening words. And I would ask you to respond to me where it is in bold type. It's in your order of service. In the face of hate, we answer the call of love. In the face of exclusion, we answer the call of inclusion. In the face of homophobia, in the face of racism, we ask for justice for all races. In the face of xenophobia, we answer the call of pluralism. In the face of misogyny, we answer the call of women's rights. In the face of demagoguery, we answer the call of reason. In the face of religious intolerance, we answer the call of diversity. In the face of narrow nationalism, in the face of bigotry, in the face of despair, as Unitarians, we answer the call of love. In the face of a world made crueler, less compassionate, more intolerant, less safe for the vulnerable by the actions of the most powerful country on earth, I light this candle in near despair, but with a glimmer of hope that these actions will not become normalized here and elsewhere, for they are indecent. and not worthy of humankind.
E ngā mana i ngā reo, e ngā rangatira mā tēnā koutou, e te whare e tū ake nei tēnā koe, e te whānau o Auckland Unitarians, e ngā manuhiri tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko tangata tiriti te iwi, ko e tū ko te kauai kai mahinga uniana, no Tamaki Makaurau a hau, ko Rachael Mcintosh tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Rape culture is a culture where we normalise sexual violence. We see this on a continuum from rape jokes, locker room banter and victim blaming, through to catcalling, non-consensual sexual photos, to sexual coercion and rape. These are the words of Jill Greer, the CEO of the National Council of Women. My friend Sam Huggard, Secretary of the Council of Trade Unions, has blogged this week on the subject of rape culture. And in his blog, he tells us of a story he heard recently at a conference discussing women working in this country in trades. The story is about an apprentice who each day would eat lunch in her car rather than in the lunchroom with everyone else. Why? Because there were sexually explicit and objectifying pictures of women hung on the wall. She was excluded and silenced and reduced to the constrained and yet visible safety of her car to sit in humiliation and isolation. There are other stories. I have heard a story of the Mcdonald's worker working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the drive-through in a small, cramped alcove, looking out on the cars crawling past, order by order, isolated from the rest of the shop, dressed in a McDonald's uniform with her name on a badge on her chest. At any time of day, but particularly in the wee hours of the morning, she was subjected to obscene comments and calls to show us your tits from late-night men who are also everyday men, looking for some sexual objectification and humiliation with their fries. And she had to pass them their food and be polite as they leaned out and leered out of their car windows. And her job included being polite to them and sunny to the next customer. Recently in Christchurch, a student nurse was attacked walking to her car after an afternoon shift, finishing at 11 p.m. Her car was parked in Hagley Park, some distance from the hospital. Because there was no staff parking available to her and no public transport and no safety on the streets of her own community. Because there are parts of her own town where she cannot be and be safe from violence. About 40 years ago, there was a woman working in the Auckland University Library who was in a violent relationship. Work was the place where her violent partner wasn't, where she could be safe for a few hours. And then he came and murdered her just outside the library as she left work. I remember that story, and I remember that one of the details was that she was from Chile. That made it seem to me like it was something that happened to someone else. And just recently when I was in Geneva, I heard almost exactly the same story about a woman in the past year in another part of the world. And now I'm an adult, and one of the things I've learnt in the meantime is that there is no someone else. These are stories of people working in public spaces. In Geneva, I also heard stories from all over the world where women work as domestic workers in the houses of their employers. Many of these women are migrant workers, dependent on their job for their immigration status. Many more are undocumented and dependent on their employer not to turn them over to the authorities. And in cases where their employer chooses to follow them to the place where they sleep so that he can rape them, night after night and day after day, they have no choice and no escape. This is rape culture, and these are stories of rape culture in the world of work. Irihapeti Ramsden has noted that experience teaches the wary observer that ideas of truth, justice, and civil and human rights are human in origin, shaped to suit the times. So what are our current times? We are in the time of Harvey Weinstein, that one looming symbol of sexual harassment and predation, who was often alone with his victims, but who was not alone. We are in the time of #MeToo, #Yo Tambien, #Ni Una Menos. We are in a time where the stories are becoming public, the stories are being told. And as Sam Huggard also noted in his blog this week, what's needed is better economic power for women to achieve equality with the economic and career power currently wielded by men. Both weak HR department-driven responses and moral witnessing and hashtags on their own completely miss the mark. One part of the route to better economic power for women is a human rights approach. Moana Jackson has pointed out that human rights inhere in people because they are human and are not diminished by disagreement or doubt or the passage of time. We are human and there is no someone else. The rights that inhere in us inhere in everyone. And in the union movement, our most basic foundation is the notion that rights must be exercised and realised collectively. The International Labour Organization is the only United Nations agency that is tripartite. Since 1919, 99 years, the ILO has brought together the governments, employers and workers of 187 member countries to set labour standards, develop policies and devise programs promoting decent work for all people. This year was my second year at the annual ILO conference, where more than 6,000 people gather to work on a number of subjects, with all conversations held in tripartite forums of workers, employers and governments. This year I worked in a committee discussing a binding international convention on violence and harassment in the world of work. When a convention is formed, it is always done over a 2-year debate, and everything that is settled in the first year may be revisited in the second year. So over a 2-week period, about 500 people met together in one large circular room to debate and shape a text that had been prepared by the ILO office after a worldwide survey of employers, workers' organisations and governments. With simultaneous translations direct to earpieces at every seat, the debate takes place through one worker spokesperson, one employer spokesperson, and with all governments having individual speaking rights. The 3 groups also spend time throughout the conference in separate caucus meetings to assess how the debate is going and discuss how to proceed. In the workers' group of about 150 people, there was a bureau of 15 or so who would rapidly caucus with the spokesperson and then carry messages out to the wider group and back to the spokesperson. In the ILO, there is no permanent 5, as in the UN Security Council, so the power is much more evenly spread. The debate is often intense, with alliances emerging and shifting as the debate proceeds. In our debate, the EU chose to speak as a bloc, as did the African group of 54 countries, and sometimes the Latin American and Caribbean countries spoke as a bloc, and sometimes individually. And so the draft text was debated line by line, and the chairperson of the whole committee, who's one of the government officials, judges the mood of the room and works for the greatest consensus possible on each point. Out of this extraordinary and complex and often intense, fraught and emotional process, we arrived at some agreed text that will come back next year to be reopened, debated again, and we hope settled. The aim of the workers' group is to make the text as strong as possible, covering the broadest number of workers and work situations, and with clear guidance for governments about the kinds of domestic laws that will be necessary to have a real effect for people who are currently unable to enjoy decent work, unable to enjoy a decent life because of violence and harassment in the world of work, including the women whose stories I have just told. Some of the most contentious debate was over the definitions of terms. The dryness of the definitions of violence and harassment, worker, and the world of work that we eventually settled on belies the passion in the debate. So get your legal ears on, I'm going to read it out. The term violence and harassment in the world of work should be understood as a range of unacceptable behaviours and practices or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aim at, result in, or are likely to result in physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm, and includes gender-based violence and harassment. Gender-based violence and harassment should be understood as violence and harassment directed at persons because of their sex or gender, or affecting persons of a particular sex or gender disproportionately, and includes sexual harassment. The term worker should cover persons in all sectors, both in the formal and informal economy, and whether in urban or rural areas, including employees as defined by national law and practice, as well as persons working irrespective of their contractual status, persons in training, and including interns and apprentices, laid off and suspended workers, volunteers, job seekers, and job applicants. The world of work should cover situations A, in the workplace, including public and private spaces where they are a place of work. B, in places where the worker is paid, takes a rest break or a meal, or uses sanitary and washing facilities. C, when commuting to and from work. D, during work-related trips or travel, training, events, or social activities. E, through work-related communications enabled by information and communication technologies. And F, an employer-provided accommodation. So that was long and that was dry, but the reason I read it out is because it was fiercely debated and because it matters. Because the definition of worker includes apprentices, we can expect protection for the apprentice who eats lunch in her car. Because the definition of violence and harassment includes practices that are likely to result in harm, we can expect an employer to redesign the work practice that sees the Mcdonald's worker on her own at 2 a.m. with carloads of harassers. Because the definition of worker includes people in the informal economy, no matter their contractual status, we can expect governments to resource their labour inspectorates to enforce a safe work environment for an undocumented migrant domestic worker. Because the definition of violence and harassment refers to economic harm, we can expect governments to pass laws and provide resources that increase women's economic power. Because the definition of the world of work includes commuting to and from work, and because we know that domestic violence has a huge impact on women in and out of work, we can expect other governments around the world to pass laws like Jan Logie's Domestic Violence Bill, so that the workplace can be part of the solution to domestic violence. Because human rights inhere in us for the simple fact that we are human, and because there is no someone else, this is also our business. And because these things are all up for debate again next year, and because there are voices in the debate who seek to weaken the text to ensure that it can never be more than a non-binding recommendation, to reduce the question of violence and harassment to something that happens to individuals rather than recognising it as part of rape culture. And because of rape culture, this is also our business. I close with a quote from Paulo Freire. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Amen.
A meditation by David Chalk. In a civilized land that accepts duty to all, citizens have rights, some great, some small. This is how things should be to those who value truth and fairness and justice and decency. But those who treasure money and the power of wealth seek to remove such rights through deceit and stealth. They claim that duty comes before such rights, but they accept no obligation for causing others to lose their rights. Is their loud refrain but fulfilling their own duties is something they disdain. For rights are for the powerful, whilst duty is for the poor. And decency and justice, the country provides no more. Human rights matter to ensure justice for all, for saints and for sinners, for all people great and small. The alternative is ugly, with justice a forgotten myth, with power replacing fairness, and a society that is truly sick. My closing words are by Andrea Hawkins Camper. May we see all as it is, and may it all be as we see it. May we be the ones to make it as it should be. For if not us, who? If not now, when? This is answering the cry of justice with the work of peace. This is redeeming the pain of history with the grace of wisdom. This is the work we are called to do, and this is the call we answer now, to be the barrier and the bridge, to be the living embodiment of our principles, to be about the work of building the beloved community, to be a people of intention and a people of conscience.